a sanctuary in silence.
My home became my fortress. Located on the outskirts of a small town, it was simple and unremarkable, a one-story building with a tiled roof and a small garden at the back. Before the apocalypse, it seemed like an ordinary place to live, where neighbors knew each other by name and children played outside. Now it was an island of safety in a chaotic world. The front door was reinforced. I had replaced the standard lock with a heavy-duty one in advance and now secured it further with heavy furniture panels. The windows, especially those facing the street, were covered with thick curtains to prevent light from attracting attention from the outside. Some of them were boarded up with wooden planks, leaving narrow gaps for ventilation.
The basement, the heart of the shelter.
But the most important part of the house was the basement. I began setting it up long before the world fell apart. Initially, it was just a hobby, creating a small stockpile in case of food shortages or water outages. Gradually, the hobby turned into something much bigger. The basement was deep, cool, and well protected. Its concrete walls, separated from the outer walls of the house, gave it a bunker-like feel. In the corner stood metal shelves stacked with sealed boxes organized by category: canned goods, grains, dried fruits, pasta, chocolate. Everything was stored in airtight containers to keep the supplies fresh and safe from pests. On another shelf were medical supplies, from basic antiseptics and bandages to antibacterial drugs, and even several packs of painkillers. I collected them little by little, never considering them excessive. In a separate box were water filters, purification tablets, and several bags of charcoal for homemade filtration systems. A special place was reserved for a water tank. I had bought it several years ago when survivalism became a serious hobby. This 200-liter metal tank was filled with pre-purified water and connected to a filtration system. Nearby were additional water bottles, just in case the main tank was compromised. Energy supply remained my Achilles' heel. I had several powerful power banks and a hand crank generator, which could temporarily support flashlights, a radio, and other essentials. But this was only enough for short-term needs. That's why the memory of the charging station lingered in my mind. I knew it could be a lifesaver.
Cozy and organized.
To avoid going insane, I tried to maintain order. Even in this chaos, it was important for everything to have its place. In one corner stood an old bed with a mattress, my primary sleeping spot. I covered it with several warm blankets that had recently been used for picnics. Next to the bed was a small table which now served as both a dining area and a writing desk. On it lay a notebook and a pencil where I kept notes. How much food had been consumed, what supplies needed replenishment. A map of the city with marked points for future expeditions also lay there. On the walls hung battery-powered lanterns. They were reliable and easy to use. Although I had a stock of batteries, I still conserved them by using light only when absolutely necessary.
Personal space.
In this shelter, I kept not only survival items, but also things that reminded me of the past. On one of the shelves was an old photo album. Pictures that once seemed like ordinary moments of life now felt like windows into another world. Also, in the basement was a small backpack, my emergency survival kit. It contained the essentials: a flashlight, a knife, a change of clothes, a first aid kit, some food and water. I could grab it at any moment and leave the house if necessary.
Silence.
The house was eerily quiet. Over 2 weeks, I had grown accustomed to the absence of cars, neighbors' voices, and the noise of televisions. Now, any sudden movement or sound outside made me freeze and listen intently. I had learned to distinguish the creaking of wood, the rustle of wind, and the occasional noises of wildlife. Every day I took time to observe. I would climb to the attic, where I had a small opening to watch the street. No one passed by, no one looked into the house. This gave me a sense of security, but also reminded me that I was completely alone. This sanctuary in silence was both a refuge and a prison. It offered protection from chaos, but also forced me to consider what would happen if I ended up trapped here forever.
Plan of action.
After 2 weeks spent in the relative safety of my shelter, it became clear that no matter how well thought out my supplies were, they weren't infinite. To survive longer, I needed to venture outside. My plans began to take shape. The top priority was energy. Even the most reliable flashlights, batteries, and generators required resource replenishment. Periodic power outages in the past had taught me to prepare for such situations, but back then I could count on electricity coming back. Now I couldn't. That's why the thought of the charging station became my beacon.
Trip to the store.
The charging station was located in a small electronics store on the outskirts of the city, away from densely populated areas. The place seemed safe to explore. By then, the streets already looked deserted, shattered windows, abandoned cars, and scattered belongings. People had either left the city or, like me, were hiding. I carefully planned my route. It ran along the outskirts to avoid the chaotic city centers. Leaving the shelter, I took a minimal kit with me, a backpack with water, a knife, and a couple of power banks for trade or use.
The found bicycle.
On the way to the store, among the abandoned cars, a bicycle caught my attention. It lay on the asphalt as if someone had hastily left it behind. At first glance, it was a standard model with a rack and slightly rusted gears. I stopped to take a closer look. The wheels were intact, and the pedals turned freely. The repairs needed were minimal, tightening the chain and checking the brakes. Taking the bicycle seemed like an obvious decision. It was a gift of fate. Placing it on the roadside, I immediately considered how to use it for transporting the box containing the station, should I find it.
The electronics store.
The store's doors were wide open, but to my surprise, hardly anyone had gone inside. Perhaps many considered electronics useless in a world without electricity. As I stepped inside, I was immediately struck by the smell of dust and decay. The shelves were still stocked. The first thing that caught my eye was the row of charging stations neatly lined up along one of the walls. Among them, I spotted the very 1800-watt charging station I had been considering just a couple of months ago with a friend. Its case was intact, and the kit was complete. In addition to the station, I found many other useful items in the store. Solar panels. I took them despite their bulkiness, knowing they could power the station. Battery-powered flashlights. A few powerful models would be handy for lighting. Radios. I decided to take one, hoping to catch a signal. Tools. In a box, I found universal multi-tools and a set of screwdrivers, useful for small repairs. Cables and adapters. Just in case, I grabbed universal chargers and cables to connect to various power sources.
Returning with the load.
After pulling the charging station out of the store, I examined its box and thought about how to secure it to the bicycle. There weren't many materials at hand, but I found elastic straps in one of the cars, which were perfect for securing the load. The bicycle turned out to be incredibly convenient. Although moving with such a heavy load required effort, it was much easier than carrying the station manually. I rode slowly, looking around, but the streets remained silent. The return home went without incident. Once back in the basement, I carefully unpacked the charging station and connected it to the solar panels. Now I had something that could provide light, charge devices, and make life easier in constant darkness. The solar panel was foldable, and I planned to use it discreetly, only setting it up during the necessary charging periods for my giant power bank.
A new chapter.
Thanks to the found bicycle, I expanded my capabilities. Now, trips beyond the shelter became simpler. The bicycle didn't require fuel, and its repairs were significantly easier than maintaining a car. My Jeep remained a last resort if a sudden long-distance escape was necessary. The charging station became the heart of my survival. Now I could afford a little more light, charge the radio, and try to catch any information about the outside world. In the coming days, my plan was to explore other electronics stores and find additional batteries or accumulators to make my life even more autonomous. Every item found, every tool or device wasn't just a useful thing. They gave me hope that I could continue surviving in this changed world.
A shelter in silence.
The basement of my house became my everything. It was where I took refuge when the world above shattered into pieces. The silence here was dense and enveloping. Behind the concrete walls, nothing could be heard except my own breathing and the faint ticking of an old wall clock. This place turned out to be the only spot where I could feel relatively safe. My basement, as it turned out, was an ideal shelter. I had once considered it merely a storage area, but a few years ago I began to entertain the idea that it could become a refuge in case of something serious. Back then, it was just a thought experiment about survival, inspired by books and lists. But now, this survival kit had become my reality. On the shelves lining the walls, I organized everything I had managed to prepare in advance. There were canned goods in neat rows, with labels: beans, corn, stew. Further down were bags of grains and vacuum-sealed flour. In the corner under the stairs stood an EcoFlow charging station that I had recently hauled from a ruined store. Above the shelves hung hooks holding backpacks, sleeping bags, and camping lanterns. In the center of the basement stood an old wooden table. Its dark, scratched surface was now illuminated by the faint glow of an oil lamp. On the table lay my notebook. Writing in it had become a ritual. I recorded everything there, thoughts, plans, and tasks for the next day. It helped me stay grounded. There was minimal furniture in the basement, an old chair with creaky legs and a corner cabinet where I stored the most essential items: weapons, ammunition, and a first aid kit. By the exit stood my backpack, fully packed and ready to go. I checked it every evening: a water flask, emergency rations, a flashlight, a knife, and the first aid kit. If I had to flee, I wanted to be sure I could do so quickly. The silence here was unusual. It wasn't calming, but rather oppressive, a reminder that life above had taken a completely different turn. Occasionally, distant sounds broke the stillness: explosions, gunfire, or more rarely, the hum of an airplane passing overhead. I disliked these moments. They felt like intrusions into my small world, reminding me that this was not a dream.
A new goal.
Peace is an illusion. I understand that staying here for long is not an option. Food and water, no matter how well stocked, are finite. I must think ahead. The first decision I made: no barricades. Barricades are a signal that someone is inside. Instead, I did everything to make my house appear abandoned. I removed the curtains from the windows, replacing them with dirty, tattered rags I found in the garage. Then I smeared the glass with dirt to make it look like it had been dusty for years. On the porch, I left an overturned chair that had been lying in the backyard. A broken crate and rusted shovels now lay scattered near the entrance. The mess I created outside gave the impression that the house had been deserted for years. Inside, I left everything as it was, but moved around only at night to avoid lighting up any windows. My basement had become a true fortress, but even a fortress needs secret exits. I opened a ventilation hatch in the corner of the basement and cleared it of debris. It is now my backup escape route, in case the main entrance becomes unusable. I now try to go outside only at night. I chose my outfit carefully: a simple dark jacket and pants that make no noise. A hood covers my head and a mask hides my face. This way, I can remain in the shadows if anyone shows up nearby. Recently, while sorting through items from the EcoFlow, I found a couple more useful devices, a powerful headlamp and a compact solar battery. They could come in handy, especially if something goes wrong. Every evening, I go to one of the windows on the first floor. There is a narrow gap in the frame through which I can cautiously watch the street. So far, everything remains quiet. No cars, no people, only the occasional wind pushing debris along the road. I know there are people out there. They haven't vanished, they've just become dangerous. That's why I am careful to hide my presence. My house is my fortress, but it must remain invisible. I don't want to become someone's target. My primary weapon now is silence. If they don't hear me, if they don't see me, I am safe. But in this new world, safety is not a guarantee. It's just a brief reprieve.
Under a layer of ash,
I don't know how much longer I can survive on my own, but solitude has become my shield. With each passing day, I feel the silence gripping me tighter. But even it is not eternal. The world above lives a new life, and I merely hide in its shadows. Last night, I dared to go outside. It was so dark that my flashlight barely illuminated fragments of the ruined street. The air carried the smell of burnt plastic and ash, as if it had permanently soaked into the concrete. I moved slowly, avoiding any loud sounds. The streets resembled the set of a forgotten post-apocalyptic film. My neighborhood feels different now. Houses that were recently inhabited are now charred, with collapsed roofs. On one street, I saw an overturned truck with burnt pieces of fabric hanging from it. Near it lay someone's backpack, but I didn't dare approach. It could have been a trap. The desolation here is steeped in danger, even without people. Every time I see empty homes or destroyed cars, I feel as though someone is watching me. Perhaps it's just my imagination, or perhaps not.
the crushing reality.
Today began with my usual routine, checking my supplies. The cans of food no longer seemed endless, even though I rationed carefully. Water supplies were slightly better, but the thought of running out plagued me. I knew I'd eventually have to go out again. During my initial outings, I focused on nearby areas. These places were familiar to me even before the disaster. A small network of shops, a couple of gas stations, pharmacies. The advantage of my location was the lack of large shopping centers, which meant less mass panic. From time to time, I returned to the basement with small finds, leftover food, batteries, tools. Using an old map I found in the house, I began marking anything that could aid my survival. In my notebook, I recorded details, which stores were untouched, where useful items could still be found. Some areas had to be avoided. Radiation levels there were dangerously high, and my dosimeter was my only protection. I marked such zones in red on the map, labeling them as off-limits. Exploring familiar streets, I searched for places where resources might still remain. One electronics store turned out to be a real find. The shelves were disorganized, but deeper inside, I discovered sealed boxes with useful items. Batteries, chargers, flashlights. On another occasion, I stumbled upon an abandoned gas station with some fuel cans still intact. I transferred all of this onto my map, creating a detailed survival guide. My goal was clear: identify safe places to explore and avoid those to stay away from. I couldn't afford to make mistakes. The map was becoming more than just a tool. It was a key to my future.